now. So hi, everyone. We have a big crowd tonight. Thanks for everyone joining us tonight at this town hall with Representative Jake Auchincloss. I'm Mary Ellen Kirkulis. I'm with Massachusetts Peace Action. Mass Peace Action is the largest grassroots peace organization in our Commonwealth, and our goal is to achieve a more just and peaceful foreign policy. I am a constituent of the congressman. I live in Fall River down here in the southern part of the district, and I see a few others from our district who are with us tonight as well. I also want to note that Susan Mirsky, who is with us today, she's the lead organizer of tonight's town hall, and she'll have a message for us at the close of the event. Unlike myself, though, she lives up in Newton and is a member of Newton Dialogues on Peace and War. So today we'll be hearing from Congressman Auchincloss about his very welcome leadership on two important issues. The first is with regard to the congressional authorization that have allowed the launch of these decades-long forever wars that we have been waging, the US. And second, in his capacity as a co-chair of a new congressional caucus, the Defense Reduction Caucus, his interest in decreasing our enormous Pentagon budget by at least 10% and to put those funds towards desperately needed resources for our many communities. Representative Auchincloss entered the Marines after graduating from Harvard College and is now a major in the reserves. His military service in command of infantry in Afghanistan and special ops in Panama gives him unique insights into, as he puts it, how the US military should and should not be used. Moderating this evening's town hall, it's my pleasure to welcome Eric Edstrom. Eric is from Stoughton and is a graduate of West Point. From there, he was deployed to Afghanistan as an infantry platoon leader and later as a presidential escort platoon leader. He was selected for the US Special Forces, where he was awarded the Bronze Star Medal. And he is also the author of Un-American, A Soldier's Reckoning of Our Longest War. So a couple of notes of housekeeping. I'm just calling your attention to the array of icons that should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen, where you'll see the chat icon. So that's where you can, during our event, write any questions that you might have for the congressman on these important issues. And a final note, those of us who are not speaking should mute ourselves so there's no distracting ambient noise. And with that, I hand it over to Eric.
Thank you so much, Mary Ellen, and wonderful to be here this evening. I'm extremely excited for this event. I'm very thankful that the congressman is able to join us with everything that's happening in the news cycle, from President Biden's promise to remove troops from Afghanistan, something that some of us have been waiting a very long time for, especially those who have served, as well as other breaking news cycle sort of announcements in the last week with a new and even fatter military budget, renewing arms sales to Saudi Arabia. It's hard to imagine a more timely moment to have this discussion. And there are few people in the House of Reps to discuss these issues who are more qualified than freshman Congressman Jake Auchincloss. Welcome, Congressman.
Thank you, Eric, so much for having me. And I'm looking forward to this conversation as well. I can't think of a better moderator for it than you.
Thank you. I'm just going to set the table sort of for the format of the evening and some of the questions. I expect that we'll have sort of a wide-ranging discussion from things including sort of breaking news, as well as transitioning into some of your own sort of morals and ethics and principles that guide your legislative hands, and then getting into a bit more of the detail about specific legislation that you're intending to sponsor or support and become an ally of. So that's sort of generally the format. So probably we'll start with the breaking news and shift to the others. In terms of the questions, we've been able to assemble a bank of questions in advance from constituents from your district, as well as others who are just friends of Mass Peace Action. And we'll be taking questions from that as well. And we imagine with the amount of content to cover that we will not be able to cover everything So if it is possible, Congressman, we're hoping at the end that we would take on the work of sort of aggregating the questions and sending them to you from your constituents that we may not have gotten to. So I think maybe opening it up, there's a lot happening in the news at the moment. Maybe you would like to comment on some of your initial reactions to the news in the last 48 hours around the president and pulling troops out by September of 21 from Afghanistan.
I have vacillated by wide berths in my in my sentiments towards the president on foreign policy in the last 72 hours. First, I was extremely disappointed and angry, really, about the Pentagon budget that he announced. And then I was truly thrilled and grateful for his announcement about Afghanistan. So it's just all in a week's work for a president of the United States, I suppose. But I think, to me, let's just start with Afghanistan and just say, first and foremost, this is good news. This is good news, and this is cause in the grand arc for rejoicing. I was in Afghanistan in 2012. I was an infantry platoon commander in Southern Helmand province. And Eric, I had an experience similar to what I read about in a passage from your book, in which my platoon was tasked with guarding a supply route that was supplying another platoon further out from us. So
sounds like Operation Highway Babysitter all over again.
Highway Babysitter, a self-licking ice cream cone, as we used to call it. It was absurd, and it would have been comic if not for the fact that we were hitting IEDs and putting young men and women in danger, including Afghans as well. But it was, to me, an exemplar of the absurdity of our mission in Afghanistan and of the true futility behind it. There is a convention in Marine Corps orders and how you brief your platoon about a mission that I'm sure the Army has as well, in which you don't only brief the mission that you're giving them, you don't only tell them, here's what we're going to do, but you also tell them what your boss wants to do and what your boss's boss wants to do. It's called commander's intent. You say, here's what we're going to do, here's what the battalion commander is going to do, and here's actually what the commanding general is going to do, because we want to know all those things. So in case things change on the ground, we all have an idea of what the intent is higher up. It's very good for elasticity of maneuver if things change. I literally could not brief the commander's intent when I was in Afghanistan. I could not do it. It was never delivered to me. And that was not a failure from our battalion commander. That was a failure, frankly, from our national security leadership in Washington, D.C., because they didn't know why we were in Afghanistan. That was 9 years ago. In the interim, the US Inspector General has said in a report that the Washington Post covered, I think, quite well, that, quote, the American people have constantly been lied to about Afghanistan. So we have had a war in which not only have we spent $2 trillion, not only have we cost the lives of tens of thousands of Americans and Afghan citizens, not only have we failed in any of our missions, but we've actually damaged trust. We've damaged trust in core institutions in the United States. And so while it might feel anticlimactic given what else is going on in the world today and in the United States today, this announcement by the president, I think, is truly noteworthy. We are ending a failed experiment, and the first step in recovering from failure is to stop digging the hole that you're in. But going forward, we need to examine ourselves in a painful and introspective manner. We need to repeal the authorization for the use of military force. We need to have a commission that examines all of the decision-making that went into these last 2 decades of continued conditioned withdrawals and continued rationales for troop building. And Congress needs to reassert its Article 1 constitutional authority that it makes and declares war, and that it is going to set a high bar for how we deploy force overseas.
Thank you. And when we're sort of talking about the sort of objective outcomes of the war on terror, you know, and more specifically the war in Afghanistan, it sounds like you're quite clear that there wasn't a net win from this war. That seems like you're ready to say that. And, you know, it sounds as though you're saying that, you know, we should have a commission to figure out what's going on with the decision making so that we do not repeat these mistakes going forward. Would you be willing to go as far as to call the war on terror illegal?
I guess I would need to do more homework before using a word with that kind of freight behind it. But when the US Inspector General says that the government is lying to the American people about the waging of war, that feels pretty darn illegal to me. I mean, we need to examine that more closely. The word that I am much more, I think, ready to deploy is failure. And that's a hard word for Americans. Americans don't like the idea of failing at war.
But it doesn't have the gravity of illegality. You know, it's oftentimes, you know, sometimes when you look back in history, America after the end of a war, maybe it's Vietnam, you say maybe we made some mistakes, but to go to that next bridge to say not only was the strategy failed strategy, but it also was wrong, morally wrong. That is sort of the next step. Is that something that you would be able to say?
I think our war in Afghanistan was morally wrong. Absolutely. It's wrong to use violence unless you absolutely have to. And we used violence and we didn't absolutely have to. It was a war of choice. I think, and this is what we really need to engage with as a country, is that the deal that we're negotiating right now is the same deal, maybe even a little bit worse, than the United States could have gotten about 6 weeks after 9/11. We spent 2 decades and achieved nothing. And that's immoral when it came at the cost of lives.
Yeah, I believe Brown University, the Watson Institute, said that something like over 100 9/11s worth of civilians across the greater Middle East have been killed during the course of the war from direct combat. It's a really large proportion. And I appreciate acknowledging the size, both in terms of costs financially for the United States, as well as for soldiers like yourself and myself who were there, but also for the other side and the sort of greater sense of empathy. One question that was coming in, and this is sort of related to guiding principles, and we'll get more into specific policies, and I'd like to hear more, and I'm sure the constituents would like to hear more as well. But one of the questions that I thought was quite interesting that was raised is around healthcare in the military, and that from an early time, the United States military acknowledged that in order to have a force that was fit for combat, that they needed to be healthy. The same could be said about America's economy at large. And for that reason, isn't there a claim for having healthcare for all the same way as the military does? In the same way that it benefits a soldier to be healthy and combat ready, it also benefits an ordinary American working in any number of jobs to have that same sort of quality of healthcare.
Yes, and I mean, I've campaigned on the fact that I think we need to have healthcare for all. Healthcare is a human right. It's not a job perk. And I think the ability of the United States to care for and improve the standard of living for its people is a robust source of soft power globally. A president once said that people the world over have always been more impressed by the power of our example than by the example of our power. And to the extent that we can create a thriving society and economy in which people can express themselves and achieve their best life, I think we've got a strong, attractive influence on the world stage that's much more powerful than any kinetic interventions.
Great. And sort of transitioning, you know, and the way I think about it is sort of some of the philosophies and principles when you're applying it to governance that is sort of shaping your view. And one of the things that you've talked a good amount, as I understand it, around sort of the AUMF is repealing it. I was wanting to sort of just let you speak for a minute about what you envision replacing it. What does that sort of cover? Are there any sort of elements like special forces that would not have to apply to the same sort of rules as the rest of the conventional forces? And just let you have a sort of a minute to sort of describe your vision of what should happen with the existing AUMFs from the War on Terror, and what sort of governance structures Congress should put in place going forward.
I appreciate that. And this is an issue near and dear to my heart. There needs to be both retrospective and prospective actions taken on the AUMF. So first is a repeal of the authorization for the use of military force. And then there needs to be a backwards look, going back the last 2 decades, to understand what rationales were put in place to allow for our use of force overseas within the confines of the AUMF, because we're operating in scores of countries overseas right
Something
now.
like 80, I believe. Yeah.
Depends on which DoD.
Which numbers you're looking at. Maybe you have better numbers than I do.
But a lot. And we want to understand, turn over every stone, look at every single legal document and say, what has been the legal structure, both the foundation and the superstructure that has been built over the last 2 decades for the AUMF. So we know what we're dealing with. And then repeal and replace the AUMF. And then prospectively, it's got to be big picture, a much more muscular assertion over Congress's role in making war. And part of the challenge that we have is that when the Constitution was drafted, making war was a lot more clear cut about what we were talking about than it is now. I mean, there's always been gray areas in human conflict, but it was pretty clear when you had redcoats hitting the shore and when you didn't, and when you were conscripting people and when you weren't. Nowadays, a lot of this happens outside of the viewpoint outside of the viewfinder of the American voter. It's happening in countries a lot of voters haven't heard about. It's happening with special operations. It's happening at the intersection of the CIA and the DoD. It's happening in cybersecurity. It's happening with drones. And so it's getting much more complicated. It's getting much more, the gray area has expanded, and it's becoming much easier for the president to do surgical strikes. So we need to go back and say, the war powers resolution, this idea that the president basically gets a 90 days of freebie to do whatever he wants, no longer makes sense. 90 days is an eternity in modern special operations and intelligence. It needs to be like in the span of hours that you give the president a free hand based on self-defense of the nation. And otherwise, he needs to be consulting with Congress and getting congressional approval. And it needs to be on a country by country basis as well. If there's legitimate rationale that we are neutralizing imminent threats to the United States, then come to Congress with that, explain the rationale, and we'll give you approval for it.
Mm-hmm. And how do you sort of envision that going forward as far as drafting the policy and getting the rest of Congress on board to sort of reclaim some of these constitutional war powers that we're talking about?
Forget about the rest of Congress, try the rest of the Democratic Party. I mean, what I am describing right now, unfortunately, is not even a majority position within the Democratic Party, I wouldn't say right now. So we've got serious work to do. I think there is a general atrophy of congressional power since the Vietnam era, especially in foreign policy, but also in domestic policy making as well, where Congress has become sclerotic. It has ceded too much power to the executive on a number of fronts. And we need a modernization of Congress that allows us to be the Article 1, the primary branch of government, as the one closest to the people.
On the, continuing with the topic of the AUMF, how do you feel about, basically a sunset clause or something to that nature where Congress would have to reaffirm the decision to be at war? Take the war on terror, for example, whether that would exist in the form of every year Congress has to re-vote and reapprove an existing conflict and the deployment of troops to sort of provide a direct feedback loop to the American voter if Congress is voting the wrong way. Would you envision that once Congress sort of is able to, well, hopefully, basically reclaim their constitutional duty and fulfill their constitutional duty, that something like that could come into play down the road?
I'm actually a big fan of sunset clauses across a lot of policy domains. They're a very healthy way to force government to maintain, to update its Bayesian priors, to use decision-making language.
Great. And maybe pivoting towards the military budget, I know you expressed a certain amount of frustration early in the call and this sort of pendulum swinging back and forth of your own personal mood and seeing sort of an increase in the budget, but at the same time feeling a sense of relief as the war on terror in Afghanistan closes down to a great extent by September. Can you go into the budget a bit further? What is sort of your vision? I understand you want to cut sort of at least 10% is the quote that I often see. Can you expound on that a bit?
Absolutely. So first, the context for what we're talking about. The US military budget, as it stands right now, is the equivalent of the GDP of major countries in the world. And it is greater than the next 10 militaries combined. So we could take a significant haircut and we're still able to exert significant military might in any given situation. I do not think that it is Congress's prerogative to go into line item by line item within the Pentagon's budget and decide what should be in and what should be out. We have got a well-equipped, well-trained group of people at the Department of Defense who can make those decisions based on statements of principle from Congress, as well as the 5-year national strategy documents. I think most people can tell that we are pivoting away from a Middle East focus and towards an Indo-Pacific focus, and that can inform where they want to make their cuts. Obviously, cybersecurity and space are becoming relatively more important than land personnel, active duty Army personnel or Marine personnel. So I'm hesitant for Congress to do a scalpel line item by line item. What I do think is important for Congress to do is to set broad statements of value within our budget. And we can say at the congressional level, we think transnational challenges like climate change and pandemic preparedness, and we think interventions like diplomacy and humanitarian assistance are better ways to engage with the world than military might. And we want our budget to reflect that value statement, because budgets are statements of values. Pentagon should come back to us then with how they want to make those cuts. When they make those cuts, and 10%, by the way, should be the minimum. When they make those cuts, that is still going to be a bigger budget than President Obama left them with. I mean, Trump increased the budget by 17% during his tenure. We do not need to be spending as much money as we are in the Pentagon. They have put in a $1.7 trillion lifetime expense with the F-35 fighter jet. This fighter jet can't even dogfight effectively. I mean, it's the classic example of a camel as a horse designed by a committee. They tried to design a fighter jet that could work for every single branch of the uniformed services, and it pleases nobody. Now the American taxpayer is on the hook to the tune of $1.7 trillion. So the Pentagon, to me, has limited credibility in their statements about being starved for cash.
So if I have your position correct, it sounds like you see Congress's role not as a auditor of the military budget, but instead saying how large the pie can be. And from that point forward, the military can decide how to slice it up, that we would need more for overseas bases, this amount for cybersecurity, et cetera. Is that sort of a fair appraisal?
Well, the word auditor to me has a special meaning, which is to say, is the money being spent according to how it was authorized and appropriated, which I actually do think is Congress's job. What I mean is that within the confines of an overall budget, I do want to pay deference to the technocrats and experts who can help us decide how to allocate that money to achieve the strategy of the United States. But auditing and oversight is absolutely Congress's job as well.
So it sounds like not being too prescriptive and that you trust the experts to allocate effectively, since that's their job. Do you have a view of what the military budget should be? If it was Jake Auchincloss's world, he was able to draft the budget, it would be this many dollars. What would that number look like?
So it would be higher than 10%. I can tell you all that much. And beyond that, I would need to have more conversations. If I were the president of the United States, I would be having a lot of conversations to really understand what is required in an Indo-Pacific strategy vis-a-vis China.
Yeah, and one of the points you made, which I 100% agree with, when we're talking about a 10% trim, that's really only taking us back basically to 2018, when it was still too high then. And the 1 year incremental increase, just the 1 year increase, I think from that year, if my memory serves me correct, was more than Russia's entire military budget together. And it was something like a $70 billion increase. So trimming 10% basically is, okay, great. Well, we're still back at 2018 at a point when we're sort of fighting the war on terror, and it's not any longer fit for purpose. The budget no longer fits the position of the military and how it should be oriented. Would you agree with that statement?
I would say that there are really two broad functions to me of the US military. One is to protect Americans, and the second is to protect the global commons. And the statement to protect Americans, I would venture, is not that controversial. I think it should be a last resort, but you do need to have the means to defend yourself. And that includes proactively neutralizing people who are going to imminently target the United States through terrorist activities. But the second statement I just made, protect the global commons, might be a little bit more controversial. And by protect the global commons, I mean the international waters. Increasingly, I mean cyberspace. Increasingly, that would also be space itself. There are huge areas where there is no power great enough to ensure the passage of information, trade, and commerce unmolested. And it's a great service the United States provides to the world, that we ensure that international waters are safe. Now, in my entire lifetime, that's something that really Americans have taken for granted. The world has taken for granted that, yeah, you can sail through the Pacific and it's going to be fine. That actually, in the history of the world, is a rarity. And it has redounded to the benefit of people all over the world, and disproportionately, I would say, to the lowest income countries in the world, because global trade has disproportionately helped them. So that is, to me, a legitimate function of the US military. That's an expensive job to do, which is why I don't think that we should, cut the military's budget altogether. But through the prism of those two jobs to be done, protect the global commons, protect Americans, there is clearly a tremendous amount of fat on the bone right now.
So what else? I mean, I know earlier you said, that there are things that the military shouldn't be doing. Are there any sort of things within the remit of the military, or maybe I should rephrase it, that the military is currently doing, which is outside of what you believe their remit is? You talked about global commons and protecting basically the national territory of the United States. What about some of the things that are a little bit more gray? Whether we're talking about targeted drone strikes, et cetera, would that sort of fall into the bucket of needing a declaration of war against that specific country? Or would you still, would you basically endorse and say that that's okay? Targeted killings for specific purposes, are within their remit.
We need to have an escalation of force within the US military. I don't think it's wise to have a policy where it's either we're doing nothing or we're at war with the country. The world is more complicated than that these days. There can be individual sub-state or non-state actors the world over who are a direct threat to the United States, who do mean harm, that we do need to neutralize, that does not require a declaration of war. And so there should be an escalation of force, but Congress should be there every step of the way, and it should be both time limited and scope limited. To your other question about are there things that the military is doing that it shouldn't, I might answer it a little bit differently, which is, are there preparations or mindsets that to me are vestigial? And the biggest one is a mindset that we need to be ready to fight 2 land wars in Asia simultaneously. This is something that you might be familiar with, Eric. You're an Army guy. The Army is a major part of this. Is that the central Cold War and even post-Cold War thesis that global hegemony meant the United States needed to be able to fight 2 land wars at the same time on the Eurasian continent. We've done that, actually, in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it was a complete disaster, did not work. And it's just not an up-to-date mindset for what our military preparation needs to be. If we're fighting 2 land wars in Asia, again, simultaneously, we have made so many mistakes along the way, it's going to be preposterous. So my sense is that having 500,000 active duty Army personnel who have been trained and equipped for that mindset is no longer really necessary. And again, I say this to you, Eric, as someone who's an Army guy, so don't be offended, but it may be that the Army active duty headcount needs to take a pretty significant cut.
That doesn't affect me. I would be also endorsing such a policy. So, I think that when considering those things, is it in the best interest of America? And some of that sort of goes back to what is the return on investment for the American people when we're talking about what is a dollar going to military spending as opposed to a dollar to infrastructure, renewable energy, education, healthcare, whatever it may be. Are we allocating our dollars correctly? So I would totally be behind that. I just wanted to, because heard you say the word sort of neutralizing and talking about drone strikes, and that there needs to be some place in between. You know, there's a spectrum, there's no war and constitutionally approved, congressionally approved declaration of war. In this gray zone, is that the sort of authority of the executive branch, that they can decide who is going to be hit by a drone strike, who will be assassinated effectively?
It needs to be done in consultation and with the approval of Congress. And this is where the War Powers Resolution really needs to be updated, because the Constitution was drafted at a time that does not reflect the realities of how violence is waged today. This ability to take out a single individual, this ability to have actors halfway across the world who pose, a clear and present danger to the United States today is just not, it was not reflected in the drafting of the Constitution. We need to be fleshed out. If the president says, you know what, I think Boko Haram in Nigeria is a threat to the United States, and here's why I think they're harboring terrorists that are in training camps we have actionable intelligence or planning an attack against Americans. Boko Haram is kidnapping young women in Nigerian cities.
If I could interject one moment, Congressman, the threat of a terrorist, a foreign-born terrorist killing somebody in the United States is less than the chance of you getting killed by your own furniture falling on you. It's a small chance that a terrorist is going to come to America and kill a citizen here. So isn't there a certain amount of risk with allowing drone strikes for such a small, in terms of objective numbers, threat to the United States and its people?
I don't think I accept the premise of that question. If we look at it and say, should we have taken action against the Taliban fostered training camps for Al-Qaeda in the tribal region of Afghanistan in 99 or 2000? To me, the answer is yes. And if the president had come to Congress at that time and said, here's what we know, that they are planning an attack against the United States, and here's what we can do about it, and we have minimized to the best of our ability the risk of collateral damage, I think that's an appropriate strike. There are times.
Would you seek international? Would you seek international agreement on that? I mean, there are ways by which the UN tries to agree on these issues for multinational support for something like that. If there was a global threat, would you not use those channels instead of acting unilaterally?
It's always better to act together than to act alone. It's always better to act together than to act alone. Having said that, at the end of the day, the responsibility to protect Americans, which, as I said, is one of the two core functions of the United States military, is a responsibility that the president and Congress need to take seriously. And if necessary, they should be able to act alone.
So then that would mean potentially breaching international law.
Every nation has the prerogative to self-defense. That's not a breaching of international law.
But how one interprets self-defense, though, could be, right? That anything could be described as a national security threat.
If you're saying that national security threats have, the definition of a national security threat has been expanded grossly over the last 2 decades to keep things classified that should be public or to excuse action that should have been done through other means, I totally agree with you. But if you're saying that there's never an appropriate time to take direct action against a threat to the United States, I don't agree with that. There are times when we're going to have to act to protect Americans. It should be the last resort, but it should be an option.
But I mean, it's sort of at what level, right? I mean, if the risk that a foreign-born terrorist is no more than your own furniture falling on you and killing you, is that the appropriate amount of time to call it a national security risk and then use political violence as a form of assassination to kill that person?
Well, this is why the president comes to Congress with an intelligence briefing that says the risk of this attack is more than of your furniture falling on an American, that the risk of the attack is something like what it was in 2000 preceding the 9/11 attacks, which is a imminent, clear, and present threat.
Okay. And how would that sort of reconcile with if we applied sort of the law of universality of sort of doing unto others as we would expect them to do to us? if we were to say that we are allowed to use drone strikes in a foreign country and we assess the threat, we're the sort of judge and jury, wouldn't other countries also be able to do that to the United States?
One of the principal maxims of war is that you always want to be able to put as much distance between yourself and the enemy to prevent as much of their ability to strike you while still retaining your ability to strike them. I mean, in some ways, that's actually the foundation of tactics, is how can I still project violence onto the enemy while not allowing them to project violence onto me? So to that extent, I've never really seen the argument for why drones, for example, are any less just than a shield or body armor or a tank or anything that makes it harder for someone to kill you. Of course, we're going to try to make it harder for people to kill us if we're doing violence onto them. That's the whole point of tactics. To me, the means by which we do it is much less salient than whether the action itself is just. And violence should be a last resort, but if it is necessary to protect Americans, then it is justified.
Maybe switching gears towards sort of future threats against the United States, maybe you can elaborate on sort of where you would like to see posture of the military used going forward, whether this is in preparation for a perceived threat from China or Russia. How do you sort of see the future of national defense shaping up, and how would you try to influence it in your role?
I think to me, I would actually make that almost a bigger question at first, which is, how does the United States want to engage on the world stage with all the different levers available to us? And I think we have to reflect on the fact that after the depredations of the last 4 years under Donald Trump, our moral standing on the world stage is badly damaged. We have an opportunity between pandemic preparedness and climate change, I think, to regain our moral leadership. Right now, we are seeing that countries, including China, but also Russia and others, are using vaccines as a source of leverage in so-called vaccine diplomacy. They're trying to extract concessions. And it is unjust, and it is also an opportunity for the United States to show otherwise. I called in a CNN op-ed that I wrote recently for a Marshall Plan for vaccines, in which we take the mantle of leadership to vaccinate 7 billion people in the world. That's in our own interest, and it's also the right thing to do from a humanitarian perspective. And as we share vaccines with countries, we use it as an opportunity to help build up their own public health capabilities, which is not what China has been doing in this time. And then with climate change, again, the United States has the opportunity to take leadership for a transnational threat. Joining the Paris Accord, of course, is an important step, but I think we all recognize that much more is needed, both in terms of R&D and investments in green infrastructure, and in holding ourselves and other countries to the standards that we set for carbon reductions.
How do you think that has implications on the military, as far as, for instance, to meet a 1.5 degree Celsius objective? The military also requires, presumably, some deep cuts in decarbonization. Would you apply that sort of the same sort of Paris level drawdown to the military as well, since whether the tons of greenhouse gases come from an F-35 or a tank or your vehicle, it all goes into the atmosphere all the same?
I think that's true. I mean, the Paris standards are applied at the country level precisely so that countries can internally balance where it's easiest and where it's hardest to make the cuts. I think overall, though, I just want to de-emphasize the military broadly in our posture in the world today. Like I said, I think it's got a rightful and appropriate place in patrolling the global commons, but that is largely a passive responsibility, meaning that just by its very presence, it is sustaining that mission. And same thing with protecting Americans. The presence of the American military, keeping ourselves well-equipped and well-trained, is an important deterrent, and it's an important part of the leverage that we have when it comes to diplomacy and actually humanitarian assistance as well. But for the last 20 years, and you could argue really since Vietnam, we've had a military-first approach to how we engage with the world. And as we're, you can't bomb a virus, you can't bomb climate change. Like, it's time for us to take a much more sophisticated approach to transnational challenges.
I have a question here from Joe Hodgkin, and he says, Congressman, I'm very interested in your thoughts on nuclear weapons policy, specifically 1, no first use, 2, ending the sole presidential authority to launch weapons, 3, ending launch on warning and hair trigger alerts, and 4, there's 5, canceling nuclear arsenal upgrades, and 5, multilateral disarmament treaties with a goal of total multilateral nuclear disarmament. What are your sort of thoughts on nuclear weapon policy?
So I'm in favor of a recent proposal to delay and really, in fact, cancel the upgrades to the intercontinental ballistic missile program, which are the silos of nuclear weapons throughout the country. There are modest upgrades that you could do that would make them viable for the next 75 years as opposed to a complete overhaul. And those are one part of what's called our nuclear triad. We've got bombers, we've got planes that can carry nuclear weapons, we've got the ICBMs that are stored here in the United States, and then we've got nuclear submarines. All 3 of them, I think there are legitimate reasons for having 3 different mechanisms, but not all 3 of them need to be continuously invested in terms of the next generation capability. I think persisting and in fact, starting to wind down their capabilities over the next century is fully appropriate. From Congress's perspective, we need to modernize our nuclear protocols. That includes requirements that any nuclear strike be verified as coming from the legitimate authority, and that other executive branch officials within the National Command Authority, SecDef, and potentially also SecState need to be involved in that. For a nuclear strike, you want more than one set of eyes on it.
Got it. I'm just scrolling through here to make sure we get in some other questions as well. I mean, while I'm sort of looking through questions to incorporate from your constituents, maybe it would be good to hear a bit about what policies we would imagine you drafting in this term. It sounds like you want to take a leadership role rather than being an ally of others, who are saying we should cut defense spending or, remove the AUMFs. What sort of policies might we expect coming from your pen?
So, as some may know, I co-led a letter along with Representatives Pocan and Lee calling for at least a 10% cut to the Defense Department ahead of the president's budget. Unfortunately, he did not comply, but Congress ultimately is the one that approves the budget, and I can assure folks that we are going to be coming right back at it with our proposals. Now, what I unfortunately cannot assure folks is that the rest of the Democratic caucus and, of course, the Republicans are going to agree with that. Unfortunately, the single most effective lobbying organization in the world is the Pentagon. They are very good at what they do. They've got footprints in all congressional districts. They create a lot of good jobs. They've got extended supply chains. And they've created a bunch of feedback loops that are very powerful, frankly. And a lot of the status quo can be explained by feedback loops that are in place right now. So I'm making no promises that I can avert this in one term, but I am making a commitment that it's a principal issue for me in my career. The second thing I will say is that, to me, much of what we discussed so far this evening, the vector for it needs to be the AUMF, repealing and replacing the AUMF. I'm a big believer that in politics, a huge part of effective organizing and advocating is focusing attention on ideas that people can get their heads around and that you can explain simply and compellingly to other people quickly. That's how you build movements around it. And the end of the authorization for the use of military force is, to me, the most powerful catalyst for that. Because once you end it, by definition, you have to replace it with something, and then a very productive conversation can start. Because I really do think that the next generation of leaders in Congress are not going to replace it with something akin to the former AUMF or even the War Powers Resolution. But ending it is the first step. And I'm increasingly optimistic about that. It's actually the one area where I've found common ground with other millennial Republicans, not the one area, but a set of a few areas. Nobody who is, 40 or younger in Congress thinks the AUMF is a good idea.
Yeah. I've run into some of this as well in sort of writing with other veteran advocates, that it's sometimes easier to get bipartisan buy-in and support when you're talking about the upstream issue rather than sort of the downstream policy prescriptions of what should be done thereafter. And it might be easy to sort of work with Republicans to say, I think we can all agree that this is a bad idea, or that the AUMF should be repealed, or that the defense spending budget is perhaps too large. Some of the quarrels, political quarrels, may happen downstream of that, of what should we be doing instead? And that becomes a slightly different fight. When it comes to repealing the AUMF, is that sort of an approach that you might try to use? Is say, let's solve for the first question, which is we should get rid of this because this is obviously not serving the American people or the interests of this country, and leave some of the policy prescriptions for a later discussion to get buy-in?
So the initial, I mean, the basic point I totally agree with, which is, the first way to write a good law is to get rid of the bad law and then force the question, right? Because all of a sudden people are like, whoa, we actually need to have something in its place. I wouldn't want to delay too long, though, the replacement, because, and I mentioned this earlier, in a vacuum of congressional action, the president tends to exert his or her will. I mean, that's just the way it's been over the American experiment in the last 250 years, is that where Congress does not act, the president acts instead. And so my concern is we would replace the AUMF, repeal the AUMF, and in that vacuum, there would be a whole host of protocols from the DoD and the president that would have their own feedback loops sustaining them. So I'd want to act within a term, I would say, and really be ready to put up a new architecture pretty quickly. And there's a lot of good thought in the wings right now for how to do that.
Right. What are the things we haven't talked about tonight so far that maybe you want to have a word on, something else that we haven't mentioned?
Oh, just an open question? Sorry, I thought that was
open question. We're sort of, you and I are having a bit of a dialogue. I'm sort of scanning to incorporate some questions from constituents. There's some broad topics that we've sort of gone through a little bit, AUMF and budget, nuclear weapons, et cetera. What are things that are also on your mind that you would like to share with the Forum of Mass Peace Action and your constituents?
Absolutely, I will. I'll throw a bit of a curveball out there, actually, because I've been talking and thinking about this a lot in the last week or two, and it's related to the question of nuclear weapons. I think maybe the single most important news that I have read vis-a-vis climate change in the last year, and I try to read a lot about this, was the announcement from an MIT spin-off company that they are going to place in Devens a fusion energy reactor that they should get working in the next 10 years. Any, I think, sober-minded assessment of what we need to do to get to carbon neutrality in the near term is going to require new sources of renewable energy beyond wind and solar. And fusion energy, and I want to be very clear, fusion energy is not fission energy. So Fukushima and Chernobyl were fission, they were the splitting of atoms. Fusion is the combining of atoms. And the reason that that's so important is that when you combine heavy hydrogen atoms, your output is helium, excuse me. You take water as an input and you output is helium. So this is a very clean, renewable source of energy. So far, it's eluded scientists and engineers, but right here in Massachusetts, we're working on it, some of the best minds in the world. And by 2030, they think they can get a prototype going. To me, this is incredibly heartening news for the climate. I just want us all to recognize that as we seek to take out nuclear weapons, which we all agree are bad and not what we want to be advancing towards, as we all have concerns about nuclear fission, that we not throw the baby out with the bathwater and also go after fusion energy, which could be one of the miracles that save the world.
And on the topic of sort of energy policy, would you be in support of scaling up nuclear power as well, in terms of trying to create a base load that's not intermittent like other forms of renewables, that would be able to sort of augment the intermittency of the curve from solar and wind?
Fusion energy, absolutely. Nuclear fission, I think we would need to be convinced that it could truly be safe, and then we need to find out how we actually are going to store the radioactive waste. Now, that's a hard problem. We're only faced with hard problems when it comes to climate change, so we don't have the luxury of saying no. We have the luxury of saying, well, let's work on it. So I'm not opposed to anything that is not emitting carbon into the environment that does produce energy, because we need all hands on deck in this.
I agree. I have a question here. It looks like it's from Michael. How does the congressman feel about the billions that are dedicated to foreign military financing grants that are used to help other nations purchase our weapons?
So I do want to flag also that we have to wrap within the next few moments to get him to his 7:30.
Okay.
Thanks, Matt. So my second deployment as a Marine reconnaissance officer was training the Panamanian public forces for a month, and it was strengthening their host country capabilities. And I actually think that was a very good use of American military expertise and know-how. We were partnering with an ally. We were working with Colombians as well, and we were training them how to do patrols and how to use equipment and some of the latest tactics that we had. And we were learning ourselves actually from our Colombian allies in that. So in general, I think military to military relations can be beneficial. We saw in Egypt, for example, in 2010, I believe it was, Eric, you may know the exact date, but as there was significant instability with Mubarak's regime, high-level contacts between the American military and the Egyptian military were instrumental in keeping things on course there, because Egyptian officers had been training in American military academies for decades. So I'm not opposed to those. I'm also not opposed, and indeed I'm very strongly supportive of our military assistance to Israel. This is, I think, an important issue for us to recognize as we leave the Middle East. Our investment in Israel's security and our investment in Israel's alliances, or at least rapprochements with other regional powers, is a very important insurance policy for the stability of the Middle East.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm extremely grateful for having you this evening. I'm going to hand the mic back over to Susan with closing comments. It's been a fabulous evening of discussion. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. I know that there's some extra questions we haven't had the chance to get to. At Mass Peace Action, we'll try to aggregate those, as we said, and try to send them across. I will pass it over to Susan for some final words.
Hello?
Take it away, Susan.
Okay. Hi, we want to thank you all for attending this informative town hall meeting. Thank you, Representative Auchincloss, for your time, your willingness to listen and engage, and a special thanks for your wonderful staff who helped make this meeting possible. Thank you to the constituents of Congressional District 4, otherwise known as CD4, and all others for participating in this event, who recognize that Representative Auchincloss is an important member of the Mass delegation. This meeting is the beginning of a conversation with Representative Auchincloss on issues of militarism at home and abroad, the war economy, and the intersectionality with environmental, social, and human needs. We look forward to continuing this effort to work for a safer, more equitable, and peaceful nuclear-free world. For CD4 constituents, please join us in our Mass Peace Action Legislative Group. Email us at masspeaceaction.org, and we'll be sending out a follow-up email for your continued follow-up with Representative Auchincloss. Wonderful comments and wonderful questions in the chat, and I hope we carry forward with that. Thank you so much, and have a good evening.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Have a wonderful evening, everyone, and great work in organizing this. It was a great opportunity and great questions. Thank you.
Kevin, thank you for your help.